Why can't more women participate in our economy?
How do these fresh graduates, these females, navigate a mostly male-dominated world? Even though they are highly educated, because of that gap, it's hard for them to return back to the workforce.
The females among the workforce are not getting the same opportunity and economic participation.
I'm Aaron.
And I'm Hardish. And this is the Economy Rise podcast.
It's where we focus on things related to the economy and things that are related to your rice bowl.
You know, last episode, right, we covered this report that was put out. It covered basically the work-life balance index, right?
Right.
And if you recall, we actually sort of questioned the report, right?
Right.
It was put out by an independent company. Basically, a lot of people are referring to it as a startup. But it got a lot of publicity, right? A lot of people picked it up, both mainstream press and also online press.
Right.
And the reason why they picked it up was because Malaysia was stood at 59 out of 60 countries with the highest GDP when it came to work-life balance. So you recall, we actually kind of called out the report. And it so happened that yesterday someone pointed out to me that if you go to that report right now, you'll see that the rankings have changed.
Okay.
Were you aware of this?
Yes, because you told me.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, it's kind of surprising, right? And this is not a different report, it's the exact same report. Right.
And to my knowledge, they actually changed it without telling everyone they changed it. Right?
Yeah, I didn't know. Right? I mean, I don't follow them on social media, but someone was working on something related to the report, and then she mentioned to us, right? And I'm kind of surprised. And the change is kind of significant. We were second last, and now we are 47.
Okay, so the second last, remember last episode we were saying how it was second worst if your arbitrary ranking is 60, right?
Yes.
So now we are third worst if the arbitrary ranking is 50.
Yes, exactly, right? But the ranking is still 60, but now we're 47. But the point is that, I think we took the position that this was really an irrelevant report for the reasons that we went into in that episode.
Right.
And true enough, I think if it's so easy to change the ranking, it really calls into the question how they actually even measure the index, right?
Maybe you should do a deep dive into why they changed it.
But my final point on that is that I just wonder all the titles that picked it up and was very eager to run with their headlines. I wonder whether they're going to sort of revise their headlines now.
Okay.
Right. So anyway, on the back of that, we are here today with yet another report. We seem to be on a string of reports lately, but this is very interesting because this is the Global Gender Gap 2024 report. And unlike the previous report, this one comes from a more reputable source, is the World Economic Forum.
Right.
So I think we can take it with some measure of competence, right? So what does the report say? It says that on the global gender gap ranking, Malaysia placed 114th. And unlike the previous report, which only looked at 60 countries, this looks at 146 countries.
Right.
Okay, so 114 out of 146. But more importantly, and this is where the headline writers will have a field day, we dropped 12 places from last year.
Okay.
Right, so last year we were 102, this year we are 114. To discuss this, so we're going to go into this in a bit more detail in terms of how the report is put together, but more importantly, what it means for us economically from a gender gap perspective. So we have our very first guest on this podcast. So happy to introduce Doris, right? Coincidence that you are a female economist, right? But we invited you here purely based on your merit. So maybe you want to give an introduction in terms of your background, your profession, and really your interest in economics in general.
All right, thank you. So I'm Doris. I'm an economist and an assistant research manager at Ideas, Malaysia. I'm currently looking into public finance study. I also do ASEAN developmental studies, regional and international trade developments. In terms of Malaysia and also the region, I look at labor dynamics, poverty and inequality, some macroeconomics issue, not too big on that, and developmental economics and poverty and inequality. So gender pay gap, it comes under inequality, definitely.
Have you always wanted to be an economist?
Actually, I have never planned for that. When I was doing my undergraduate in economics, all I wanted was to graduate and come out and work in the private sector. And
Like what, in finance, in bank or something?
so I was a fickle-minded young lady, so I did a lot of internships to figure out what I want and what I don't want. So at the end of my study, I know what I don't want, but I don't know what I want yet. So it was a chance for me, an opportunity that I work in a think tank in
Right.
Singapore. And I was working on Indonesia's subnational project at that time. And that kind of got me very interested in developmental economics and regional economics as well. That's where I start to be more involved into economics. And after that, bringing all this experience back to Malaysia, I kind of think that, well, maybe, we need a female economist right now to look at this issue.
Okay. And on that point, you're not just doing research and analysis, you also write, correct? You contribute to the press as well, articles.
Yeah, I write for The Edge Malaysia and Free
Okay.
Malaysia Today. I have a regular columns there. Other than that, media mentions here and there on Awani, New Straits Times, along with Aaron as well.
Right.
Yeah, you
Sometimes
guys have co-authored some pieces, right?
Yeah, something about diesel subsidy a while
Okay.
back.
Okay, great. We look forward to seeing more of your writings in the press, right? And hopefully on more podcasts as well. But let's get back into our topic today. So as I mentioned, it's a global gender gap. Maybe we'll just give some context in terms of how they arrive at this gender gap report, right? So there are 4 sub-indexes. Doris, maybe you want to just give a quick introduction to the 4 sub-indexes and how they measure it.
Okay, so for this gender gap report, World Economic Forums, they deal with 4 dimensions: economic participation and opportunity, education attainment, health and survival, and political empowerment. So to just give a bit of context, what this entails, economic participation opportunities look at how is the gender gap in terms of labor participations, in terms of wages, right? Educational attainment look at primary enrollment rate of both male and female and what are the gap between it. Health and survival deal mostly with birth rate between male and female, which is not that relevant to us. This will be more relevant in China or India with one-child policies. Then they tend to favor one gender over the other. But in Malaysia, it's kind of occur naturally. So let's not take that numbers to
Right. Or even
Very
in
familiar.
more less developed places where infant mortality is high, right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
definitely. And also, so health and survival also have a second indicator, which is life expectancy. So again, this is comparative to other country, and we know that female live longer than male in all countries, almost all countries.
Why is that? I've never.
Sorry, biologists.
This one is not about discrimination.
If you go online, you'll see there's this channel like why male live shorter or something like that, and then they show all the stupid dumb things that the guys do, right? Like all this like
So maybe it's not even
daredevil
biology.
stunts.
Yeah. Okay, sorry. Go on.
No problem.
And fourth one, right?
And fourth one, definitely political empowerment. How many MPs we have, how many head of state we have in
Right.
the government. Obviously, we are not doing very well on that.
Okay. So just to add on to that, remember earlier on I mentioned that the big picture here is that we fell down the rankings, right, by 12 places. So something has to explain the drop. So actually the drop, we can attribute it to 2 of these 4 sub-indexes. So the first one is economic participation and opportunity. Last year we were 89th. This year we are 102nd.
Right.
And on political empowerment, we were 122nd. This year we are 134th, right? But in line with this podcast, Economy Rise, we will definitely focus more on the economic participation part. I think that's something that a lot of it can be very passionate about. But there is something also that is very interesting here, right? Which is educational attainment. You want to add some context to that? Why? Yeah, I mean, when I saw this, I was kind of surprised. But then again, when you look at it, it kind of makes sense as well, right? Which is basically we are the first. Yeah, you want to maybe give some context to
What are
that?
the few things we are number one in the world?
Yeah.
We are number 1 in primary enrollment rate. So
So primary school, is
primary school enrollment rate.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
because
we-
it's mandatory, right?
It's mandatory.
And
Yes.
to be clear to the audience, we are number one means we are tied with everyone else who are also number one.
Which a
Not
lot,
that we are better than
a
everyone
lot of
else.
developed countries will be there, and us as well. The context is, yes, it's primary enrollment, right? But even when you look at our tertiary education,
Yes.
right? Okay, so we pulled out another data. This is looking at higher institutions. To be clear, this is public higher institutions, but I think it would be reflective anyway. In 2022, the number of male students who enrolled was 282,000. The
Right.
number of female was 405,000. That's a difference of almost about 100,000. So even in higher education, actually, so in primary, it's parity, right? One means parity, right? But actually, in higher education, it is not parity. It is in favor of women, right, female.
Right.
But the problem is then, when I look at this, the what stood out to me is that we are doing so well in terms of education attainment across the board, across the entire life cycle, but then it's not translating to economic participation.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. And the only reason I say that is because we have to also take this in comparison to many other countries in the world where children, and especially young girls, don't even get to go to primary school or secondary school, right? So I don't know whether this is worse or better because we are giving everyone opportunity when it comes to education, but there's something that's happening when it comes to the economic side.
Right.
What? I don't know. I'm happy. I'm
So maybe
keen
just to
hear,
parody, right? How does the misogyny only start at the adult world?
So, okay.
Any thoughts on that?
Well, so I guess when you're in school, we want to get as many people to participate as possible, and we don't really, care whether it's a male or a female. And when female choose to enroll more in tertiary educations, we encourage that, right? Because it boosts up our enrollment
Talent
rate,
and all that,
graduate rates as well. But when it comes to economic reality, after they graduate, they still have to face with the existing economic dynamics that's already out there.
Right.
So how do these fresh graduates, these females, navigate a mostly male-dominated world?
Right.
In some industries, actually, I think like for Malaysia, we are getting better. But there are still some gaps over there in terms of when you look at the older generations, there are still people who have already worked 20 or 30 years in their role. So if female, mostly they are in a more softer role, like counseling and HR and nurses. For male, mostly in like engineering and technologies, right? IT, this kind of role. So these are like existing in the workforce. For a female who are, let's say, a technologist who try to find a job in IT, it's a bit rare, right? It's not common, right? That's why and IT and engineering, because Malaysia is a manufacturing country, we tend to have a lot of MNCs here that can pay high wages. That's why there are some disparity between those wages. But of course, when we later on we can look at how even within the same occupational industry there are some gap as well.
Okay, so I'm just going to give two other key points, and then I think we're going to get into the meat of why this is happening. So I just want to quickly point out that the government actually, as far as I know, has a policy of, especially in the GLCs, right, of requiring 30% women on board positions.
Is it a requirement, like a law, or is it it is an actual law?
I don't know if it's a law, but for GLCs, I believe they are required to practice this 30%.
Right.
And I think therefore then it forces the private sector to follow.
Okay.
But I cannot say for sure whether it's written.
Do you happen to know?
Not the law.
It's not a law.
Yeah. Okay. So, but and I think there was a deadline, right, for them to achieve this. But you're looking at Department of Statistics, the latest I could find was for 2022, and the number stood at 24.6% in terms of women on managerial positions, right? But I don't know if you've heard of this other, I'm sure you have heard of them, it's called the 30% Club. So this is a sort of a movement that they try to advocate for women representation on public boards, right? So there's a chapter here in Malaysia, 30% Club Malaysia. And based on, it was interesting when I looked at their report, they said that we actually achieved 30.7% last year, 2023. And if you look at, so we sort of met that, but it's worth bearing in mind that in 2015 it was only 14%. Right? So it's taken that long. Okay. So that was just the 2 points.
But actually, I'm quite interested that we actually got to 30%.
Yes.
Isn't that kind of a milestone?
but qualification, the 30% Club, according to the statement they put out, they only track women in board positions for the top 100 public listed companies, right? So it's the top 100. I think we have about 900 plus.
Okay, how many are GLCs?
Well,
50%?
To be honest, maybe I think about 30-40%.
Okay.
30.7%, but it's only the top 100 public listed companies.
Okay, very quickly, you get your thoughts. How do you feel about that?
I think this is like a good progress for Malaysia, especially at the top companies. You need to set out examples, and top companies are normally the one that drive the economic and GDP developments in Malaysia. And if women can be put in the positions to make some strategic recommendations and decision-making power at that very top, then it will trickle down to the rest of the economies. And maybe when women are seen as a leader at this position, it encourages other women to also pursue the same dream, one. And second, also make the whole society more receptive of having women as leaders.
Right.
Okay, I want to come down to the economic issue here, right? So in summary, right, all of that basically it just points to a problem with economic participation, right? And there is a term for this from an economic term for this, which is called the labor force participation rate. I think a lot of people may have heard this term, labor force participation rate, but Doris, I think we're going to leave it to you to provide a layman's explanation in terms of what LFPR is.
Right.
So I'm just going to group people into three segments. So if you are from age 15 to 64, either you are employed or studying or unemployed, or you're not in the labor force, right? So labor force participation rate is basically employed and unemployed together over a percentage of total populations in that age range.
Sorry, what do you mean by not in the labor force?
Not in the labor force, like
they're not looking for work.
Yeah, they are not employed, and they are also not looking for work. So if over 4 months they are not looking for work, they drop out of the labor force.
So are you referring to discouraged workers?
They could be discouraged, or they could be voluntarily dropping out of the labor force, or they could be informal workers that we just don't have a measure.
Or they could be so rich they don't need to
Yeah,
work.
exactly. Yeah, they could.
Which is actually part of it,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
Yes.
So people who are not looking for work.
I hope I'm one.
That's the aspiration.
So you're contributing to the lower women LPR.
Okay. So, but within the labor force participation rate, I understand it also includes people who are unemployed but actively looking for work,
Yes.
right? Which would mean that these are people who want to work,
Yes.
but for whatever reason they maybe cannot find the right employment,
Yes.
right? Where would people who are underemployed fall? It would basically be within that, right?
Underemployed will fall underemployed.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, as long as they work more than actually as long as they work at least 1 hour a week, or
Okay.
they have like an existing employment contract, whether it's a freelance or part time, they are still considered employed.
So the reason we want to talk about LFPR or labor force participation rate is because I think this is a much more descriptive statistic compared to unemployment rate, right? Because unemployment rate doesn't give you enough of appreciation in terms of, like as you mentioned, there's so many dimensions, right? There are people who want to be employed but cannot find jobs also, which is a very important thing. And I feel that probably women might fall into this category, especially those who are in caretaker or caregiving roles, right? They probably want to be employed, but because of various reasons or the structure of how jobs are at the moment, they can't get in. So another quick top line data, according to World Bank in Malaysia, we actually break it down based on gender, since we're looking at gender parity, gender gap, right? The labor force participation rate for males in Malaysia was 78%, and for females was 51.6%, which is a difference of more than 20%.
Yeah, so Doris, get your thoughts on this.
It's still quite low. I mean, the gap is actually very huge. So it means that where does this 20% of women's...
So
The
let me do the
difference,
math for the
difference between
audience.
the two.
It's a 27% gap, right, between men and women.
27% gap.
Yeah.
So means that for every 100 male that's in the labor force, 27 females are not in the labor force. And if you translate that to the
Actually,
population...
not true, right? I mean,
Yeah.
because the
Because-
male labor force is 80,
Yeah.
what?
80, yeah.
Right? So it's less
Well,
than that. It's less than
Less
that.
than...
So I think
No, it's a
so
gap.
the benchmark is not 100% labor force, right?
Yes.
Because you'll never get that
Yes.
for reasons like there will always be some people who don't need to work,
Yes.
right? So I think that just to set a context, 78% males in the participating in the labor force is the benchmark we need to use when we compare to female, right? Because
Right.
that's the differential. So basically, as you're saying, it's 27%.
So
right?
basically, the 78% is the 100%.
Yes, in a way.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And I think also one thing worth pointing out is that this is Malaysia's
Yes.
LPR.
Yes.
And to our surprise, we actually found out that it's not so far behind even the Western developed economies.
For the
Yes,
males
definitely.
part,
Yes.
right?
For the male.
Even the females.
Okay.
Right? So in the EU, it's 61% versus our 51, right?
Right.
And I'm not here to justify it.
Okay.
I'm just saying that there are a lot of factors in the measurement of it,
Yeah.
right? As we covered in our last episode.
Well, I'll give one example, right? We discussed this before. So every time we talk about female empowerment or rather like female participation in work and all that, ultimately the gold standard seems to be Scandinavian countries,
Yes.
right? I think very few people argue with that. So I actually pulled a number for Denmark. And in Denmark, the male LFPR, that's the labor force participation rate, was 67.8%, and the female one was 59.5%. So, but what's interesting here is that the differential is only about less than 10%,
Yep.
right? It's only about 7%.
Because the
differential.
natural implication would be that in Scandinavian countries, the gold standard,
Yeah.
the female participation rate would be the same as the male participation rate.
Yes. Yes.
Actually, it's because the gender equality movement only came about in the last few decades.
Right.
And most of the older generations, they're already stuck in the economic gap.
Right.
And if they don't work for 20 or 30 years, they're unlikely to join the labor force just because female are now more equal than men.
Right.
So if we look at the younger ones, there are more equality over there because in Western countries.
So do you happen to have a number?
I don't have the exact number, so we can look that up. But I do know like there is a gap. The wider gap is at the older generation,
Right.
and that also happened in Malaysia, of course.
Right.
So
Okay.
hopefully that if you
Hopefully,
actually
yes.
get a narrower age range, you'll
Yes.
see,
Yes.
hopefully the gap is narrowing,
Yes.
right? That's what
Yes.
we were aspiring
Yes.
to.
I think we can all agree that it's important to push the institutional momentum, right, in favor of the younger generation's ratio going up.
Yes. Actually, because what we are looking at is an index, and our ranking changes depends on other countries as well. So if other countries are improving their labor force, female labor force participation rate and their wages much more than Malaysia, so even though we improve, we will still drop in ranking. So
Right,
this is
right,
something
right.
we have to keep in mind.
Right.
Okay, so now that we know there is a differential about 27%, right, between male and female in Malaysia, now let's get to the exciting part. Why is that so? What is causing this? Why can't more women participate in our economy? I mean, go wild. This is your chance.
There are many reasons.
Yes, get it out.
I might push back on some, but for the
No,
purpose
it's fine, it's fine.
just for the sake of argument, right? But yeah, the floor is yours. My big question is, why can't more women in this country, considering the education that they are getting, participate in the economy?
All right. I think in the past few years, we have to consider COVID as a big factor. Before COVID, actually, female participation rate is going up quite steadily. And during COVID, it drops drastically. And we see this in especially families and who have kids and all that. Most of the time, the male remains in employment and the female just drop out of the labor force and stay at home and take care of the child.
Right.
And after 1 to 2 years or even 3 years of not being in the labor force, it's hard for these women to go back into the labor force because there's simply a skills gap over there and experience gap, right? And also we see this is even more serious if it's younger women because at the early start of your career is the most important part where you make a headway in the industry. And if you miss that period, you are going in as an entry level at age 30, right? Or age 32, right? Which is sometimes too old for a lot of companies to take in. So these women sometimes either they remain out of the labor force because they don't find a way back in, or they work in jobs that are lower than their qualifications. So causes a lot of underemployment issues.
Right.
So I want to maybe instigate this a bit more, right? I think my question would be to really understand this issue, whether it's a question of misogyny or whether it's a question of not being able to access opportunity because of, say, for example, domestic responsibilities, like caring responsibilities, right? To me, the only way to understand this is to then separate women even further into those who are want to be moms and those who are who regardless whether they're single or not, who don't want to have mom or don't want to have kids, right? And I'm just wondering whether that would actually provide some context in terms of prejudice, or are we talking about so outright prejudice? That means regardless, right, whether you have a child or not, it doesn't matter. Or actually, women who don't have children are faring much better than women who do have children.
Well, we couldn't exactly see this from the data, but anecdotally, yes, women who does not have children, so don't have a families, tends to stay in the workforce much longer than those who have that. It's just simply because also of both economic and social reason. Like economically, if the women were to give birth to a child, and childcare cost is actually quite expensive in Malaysia.
Yeah.
So for a lower income, it might make more sense for the women to stay at home if they have at least like 2 kids maybe.
Right.
Than to go out and work and pay for a nanny. Right? And between male and female, if the male is earning more, which is most often the case, then it makes sense for the female to stay at home.
But this we're talking here about economic participation,
Yes.
right? And so there are a lot of different ways to participate in the economy. And I know that a lot of sort of maybe women at the sort of lower end of economic earning, right? They tend to, or rather B40 lah, right? Families, they tend to do a lot of home-based work, right? For example, they might offer their services, or they might provide like catering, home-based and stuff like that. Is that captured in the LFPR? Or?
That is not captured. So
Right, okay.
yes.
Okay.
So gig workers aren't captured in the LFPR?
When the government do like a employment survey, they will ask like very specific questions like, do you have an employment contract? Do you work more than 30 hours a week? So if any of this is yes, then it's considered employed. Right? But if you are talking about, so for gig workers, if they are employed by, if they have done work 30 to 40 hours a week, then they report as such and they consider employed.
Right.
But for female workers who are doing their own entrepreneurial, maybe helping out with their friend's business once in a while, and they don't hit that mark, then they are considered unemployed.
I see.
Or out of the labor force.
So
even,
pretty much
yeah.
it's roughly the same as if you had an official job.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so it doesn't count informal work. The reason I bring that up is because actually I'm sure you're aware as well, there's a lot of even government agencies that are running a lot of entrepreneurship
Yes.
program for women
Yes.
in this category, right?
Yes.
Trying to help them move up the economic scale, or at least be able to earn additional income. Right now, I imagine, of course, it will still be a struggle for them economically, but definitely based on what you're saying, this would not count as part of the participation rate, right, in the economy.
So also it depends on how the women answer the surveys. So if
okay.
if the women is only providing like small businesses like selling baking goods on Facebook, most likely she's not counted. But if the woman is let's say providing on a part-time basis, work at a childcare center for a period of few hours a week, then she can be considered even though she doesn't have a formal employment contract.
Right. Okay, so obviously a labour force participation rate has to be addressed. But I think the much more popular sticking point that women have with regards to this topic would be the gender wage gap.
Yes.
Right? So, obviously we as men probably don't have the right to talk about it. maybe you can tell us more, or just give us your sense on what the situation is.
Yeah, being on the podcast with 2 men here also means that I know they're earning more than me, probably.
Really? Not necessarily. You never know. I mean, unless we all reveal our salaries now.
Ideas is already.
You never know, you know.
So yes, gender wage gap for male and female, for all levels of education, all ages, all kind of occupations, male tends to earn more than female. Overall, I mean there are like 1 or 2 exceptions, but generally yes.
But we are comparing like within the same
Okay, maybe
titles,
let's just
right?
get something out of the way, right? There's this big debate in the populist sphere between the pros and the cons, the supporters and the non-supporters of this, right? The supporters,
supporters of what?
whether the gender wage gap exists as a legitimate concern.
Okay.
So obviously, let me frame it right very quickly. The supporters will say that, okay, it does exist, right, for all the reasons explained. The detractors will say that, oh, it's not being measured properly, right? It's not legitimate because, maybe women choose jobs which tend to pay less. So it's not really a discrimination per se. So maybe you can get an economist's thought on this. What do you think?
Actually, that argument does not stand because even if we break it down to occupational level, like managers, professionals, sales and services workers, right? Even within that segment itself, male still earns way more than female. Like in managerial positions, male earn like 23% more than female. So on a median level, male managers earn about $6,000,
Right.
and then female managers only earn like 4,900 ringgit.
This is for at par level in terms
Yes,
of
managers.
Right. Okay.
Right. Of course, the data does not tell us what kind of management level they are at, whether they are junior or senior management.
Right.
But also that if there's a gap in a managerial position, means that why are women not being pushed up the rank to be on the same par as men?
Right.
Because obviously, if they're in a managerial position, they are in the labor force, they've done something right to be there in the first place. What prevents them from going from junior management to senior management?
And would you say this is more of a average data across, by painting with a broad brush, right? And what do I mean by that is that perhaps it might reflect how women might want to wear different hats in different roles. And therefore, or maybe I can put it this way. Do the individual women who actually want to make the sacrifice to pursue the roles, are they able to actually achieve the same wage as men? Or is there really a misogynistic element here?
I would think that if the women are already at professional levels or management level, a lack of drive to pursue higher is not like a very convincing argument to me. But since they're already make it up there, what's more to push a level up? It's about like the women who are not choosing to go into this profession in the first place, that probably has a lower drive or less confidence or has this gender stereotypes that female has a female role and male has a male role. Maybe to provide a bit of context to that, women has a traditional role, still in our society, and a lot of them are also doing like homemaking roles, softer roles, and this shows in the data, right? Like women in the labor force predominantly perform more feminine role, like services, sales, clerical support, and this combined form about 48%, almost half of the female labor force. Where does male go? Males goes to more industrial and technical role, like in technicians, plants and machine operators, assemblers, right, craft, in trade related matters. So you can already see male and female has the different occupational preferences in the workforce.
Do you have any numbers to back this up? Because obviously it's great that we have a discussion about it. But for the benefit of every single person listening to this, right? Maybe some hard numbers will be more convincing.
The hard number is actually in my laptop. The numbers that I gave you is the percentage of that. So
okay.
Half of male and half of female.
But does this start at the choice of degrees? So for example, what you're saying is the problem is actually the type of occupation, right? But the type of occupation usually is also a function of your qualification. So is the problem starting after leaving high school, the choices women are making in terms of the type of courses they want? Because I think to me that is something that's harder to imagine, because I can't think of any external pressure that's leading women to choose one course over other. But I might just be ignorant, right? So is that where the source of the problem is?
Definitely there is. Although we increasingly see the government is using policies to encourage women to take up STEM, right? Science, technologies, engineering, and mathematics, and also IT, that encourages more women participation in this role. So I am quite optimistic that we will see more female engineers and female technicians out there. Although some roles does requires physical, it's quite physically demanding. Like if he's a technician or construction roles, then it requires the man's kind of physique to be able to perform those jobs. So then it's hard for female or even non-desirable for a lot of females to go into this occupation.
Okay, I think one other thing that is also talked about a lot is that there is this time preference per se, right? So of course we should always acknowledge that there is a misogynistic element in corporations, right? Capitalists are always bad, right? But at the same time, I think it also is fair to say that women themselves prefer, right? Some women prefer to allocate their time outside of purely capitalistic pursuits, right? So this one way this is expressed is in the time-related employment, right? And we also talk about how wage disparity is related to years of lost experience, right? So what do you think should be done in that line? Like in terms of, should we go all the way to affirmative action? Right? Because obviously the detractors of this will say that women should only be paid what they contribute, right? So do we go all the way to the other side where we implement a socialist kind of approach, or what's your thought? I mean, I can't say, right?
I mean, you can
Of course
say
you
it.
can.
Yeah, of course you can.
As long as you stand by it.
Okay,
Yeah.
Whatever you say, you
I
stand
have
by
less
it.
credibility. Okay?
I mean, there is also this like common perception that only female understands females'
I don't buy
economic
that.
participation, and we are the only
As
one
an employer, I
allowed to
don't buy that.
comment.
Okay.
We are very much all for male feminists to also have some viewpoint on this, of course.
Sure.
Because yes, years of employments and educational attainments, all that does leads to the wage, and that's why I think it's a concerning issue that female feel trapped, not being able to go back into the labor force and utilizing their skills and have the opportunity to develop those experience after they take a career break. And it's of course it's very biological that when female needs to go on maternity leave, you simply just can't work during that period of time, right? And these are one of the disadvantages female has against male.
Right.
What we can do is to make it easier for these females to go back into the labor force and start at the good point, maybe at the point that they left the employment, so they can continue and build on their career from that point onwards.
So would that amount to a socialist approach? Affirmative action in effect?
I'm not for affirmative action. I'm not for like hard enforcement of this rule, but more of like encouragement and on the social and policy levels.
Right.
Give some incentive for these women to make it easier for them to transition from stay-at-home mom to workplace.
So maybe I ask you, what are the realistic, practical implementations of such a solution?
Well, Talent Corp has one, which is called Talent Corp Career Comeback Program.
Right.
For women who wants to go back to the labor force, they help these women. They receive the CV, they give them some career counseling, and then they help these women to connect with the proper industries, give them like opportunities to pursue it, right, instead of blocking it.
But is that enough? Do you feel that's enough?
Well, I think it's a good step. Of course, it's always not enough.
Okay.
And the program itself is still as its infancy, so not a lot of people know about it. So if women, they don't know anyone or they haven't heard of this, they are not digitally savvy,
Right.
they won't be able to make use of these platforms for them.
So Talent Corp, if you want us to sponsor you, just give us a call, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, just one last point on this, right? Since you're an economist, I would like to get your thoughts on this. The care economy is growing, right? The global demographics is getting older. And one thing that Japanese economists will be aware of is that there has been a marked improvement in the unit gender wage gap, as well as just overall differences between the Gini coefficient, right? So given that the whole world is moving in the direction, right? And in our last episode, we also talked about the care economy, how it's supposed to maybe help Malaysia's economy as a whole. What do you see the care economy's role in towards closing the gender wage gap, especially in the context of how the care economy seems to favor women workers, right?
I think it's a good step. It's a good solution progress for us to close the wage gap at the top level. So if females and the caring economies could get higher wages, more opportunities, bigger industries, then yes, we can see that. But at the same time, I think we shouldn't just say that female are supposed to be caregivers, right? Or this is the industry just for women. I think what we should do is to allow everyone to have the opportunity to pursue their own career in the industry and occupation that they want. So what we want is representations for even male workers can go into a care economy. There's no problem in that, right? And I think there's also some kind of disparity in caring economy today because a lot of nurses tends to be female. And then for doctors, it's a bit more mixed, like either 50-50 or more male doctors out there. And doctors are the one that's getting higher paid.
Okay.
even in the care economy. So you can see even within that sector itself, there's a gender disparity.
Right.
I want to maybe come back to this issue of, like, say, for example, maternity leave and all that, right? And this is an issue that I think a lot of people, when they try to talk about this, they tend to be very careful about, how they cover this, who they're willing to call out and stuff like that. So I'm going to put forth sort of my own personal experience, but also something for everyone to think about. And I think that the issue really here is one of costs that people don't actually consider, right? So when a woman takes maternity leave, for example, 3 months, in Malaysia, the cost is fully borne by the employer. And the reason I say this is because if we want to have a very honest conversation about this, we have to really be willing to look at the issue. So a lot of women's groups that I know of, when they talk about this issue, they will then point to, as we mentioned, right, the benchmark, which is Scandinavian countries, in terms of why they can have up to 1 year maternity leave and all that. But I always find that they leave out the fact that that is paid for a lot of times by the taxpayers. It's not paid for by the employers, right? Why is it so important for us in our economic circumstances? Because, as we have covered also in previous episode, when you look at our employment sector, our employment profile, it is majority are SMEs, right? And again, we also looked at this separately in terms of the loans that these companies take. It's very short-term loans, which really tells you, it gives you a clue that they're going into funding OPEX, right? Operational stuff. And these loans tend to be about 3 to 5 months. So it means that companies actually cannot afford this. Right. And this, you have to be willing to talk about this, right? So it is read as prejudice,
Yes.
right? It is read as prejudice. I'm sure it exists, right? But when you consider that from an economic cost point of view, you are forced to pay for an employee who is not being productive. Now, I know this is, so a lot of people will find this very jarring, right, this conversation, but you have to understand this, right? Now, when you think about what we are investing in terms of our human capital, we are doing remarkably well at the educational side. We are spending whatever we need to spend, literally, to get everyone to attain education, right? So it means that actually the government should, or society should also be willing to spend to maintain that human capital when women want to take a break to start a family, right? The cost should be borne by society. And to prove this point, I work with a lot of entrepreneurs, right? Work with a lot of business owners, and many of them happen to be female. And I actually ask all of them, if you as a female owner, would you hire someone if you know she wants to have a child in the next maybe 6 or 9 months? And the answer overwhelmingly is no. And I do not call them out because I do not think they are prejudiced. It is really the reality of running a business and cash flow, and you don't have the capacity to fund this, right? And I think that is a point that everyone unfortunately overlooks or are not willing to sort of really engage with, right? And I think there's a lot more to this, that it has to be a cost that society is willing to bear.
No, I think to be fair, right, it's not that women don't acknowledge this. It's just that it is difficult to capture the bandwidth. People have limited bandwidth to particular topics, right? So, in this spirit of good journalism, right, since we have this great opportunity, we have an economist who has a women's perspective, and we have an actual businessman, right, who has
paid maternity leave,
right, and who has plenty of experience and is credible in this to inform on the employer side of things, okay, and also has asked other women entrepreneurs what their perspective is. Okay, I'll be the impartial moderator, right, so that y'all don't argue. And
no, but I don't think you argue with
that. No,
I
don't mean. I'm joking. Okay, I didn't mean argue. Okay, but I would really like to get to a solution on this matter because.
Oh, I have an offer.
No, yeah, right. Because let me just tell you my point of view, right? I hear the theory on both sides a lot, but I don't really see a lot of people trying to meet in the middle. I'm sure it happens at the policy level, but at the public discourse level, I really cannot recall off the top of my head, right? So let's have this opportunity. How do we create a sustainable solution that increases value for society, recognizing on one hand, employers need to have cash flow concerns, right? Have cash flow concerns, and on the other hand, society does owe women in terms of having a more affirmative action policy towards what is just basic human rights, right? Yep. How do we close this gap in our capitalistic status quo? Yep. Go.
Okay, so I'll go first so that you can have the last word. Okay, fair? Okay. First of all, I want to take economic approach to this, right? So basic economics, like you mentioned, for example, capitalist, right? And it's seen as the connotation is negative. I actually want to turn that around. Actually, capitalism is really about making sure that you use your resources in the most productive means.
Yes.
So let's come back to understanding everybody is a human resource, right? Men, women, even our kids and all that. But let's look at the working population. They are our human resource.
Right.
My position is that we should spare nothing at all, right? We should, in terms of making sure that we invest in our human resources, right?
Sure.
Okay, because that is how you get full economic productivity. Okay, so now you come down to how do we do this? Because that's the constraint. My position is that, and this is where no one talks about it, companies cannot afford it.
Right.
And because companies cannot afford it, we know that if you look through the data, as I explained, right, it suggests companies cannot afford it.
Okay, maybe the framing shouldn't be what is fair, right?
Yeah.
It's more about how do you guys meet in the middle?
Okay, so how I meet in the middle is companies bear part of the burden, government bears part of the burden. You share the burden, right? Let's just say it's 50-50, right? Okay, so I do the right thing, but you incentivize me to do the right thing, which is what happens in all these countries that I use as a benchmark. Right. They are incentivized to do the right thing, right? Okay. And so therefore, society in general benefits because these women will then be able to come back. And actually, just a side note, right? This is something again that kind of shocked me. I never considered this. So in Malaysia, maternity leave is 3 months, right? In a lot of other countries that we talk about in comparison, is up to 9 months, 12 months. I spoke to someone who runs one of these companies, right? And a HR person, a woman, okay? When you look at it, it's like the cost, right, is 12 months. The cost is 4 times more, right? But she explained it in a fascinating way that I had not considered before. If you give a woman 3 months maternity leave, you have to bring on someone part-time just for 3 months, train them, and by the time you train them, the woman, the one who's coming back from maternity leave. So you're actually creating a bigger problem. What you should do is you give a longer maternity leave so that you can replace them with someone new who then also has a much longer term to come into this job. They learn the job. And then when this woman who's coming back is ready, she comes back into a new role, right? And she's provided the support to then move into a role. But this particular company, which is Reckitt Benckiser, right? They guarantee the woman who's coming back the same pay and the same level, but she's moved into a different role because her role has been replaced by someone else who they've had 9 months to really get up to speed with their role, right?
So basically create stages.
Yeah, you create stages, which actually is a very brilliant way of looking at it because that is the constraint. As an employer, do I find someone for 3 months and then it's going to take me 2 months to train them and after that, someone's going to come back? It's actually a cost,
Yes.
Okay, so we're coming back very quickly. I think you have to split the cost. It just so happens, in just the past few days, HRD has been in the news, right? We know HRD has unused monies, right?
Right.
And what is that money? Where is that money coming from? It's coming from companies that pay a levy for human capital development.
Right.
So that is where I think you can use this unused money to subsidize the cost that employers have to bear when it comes to maternity leave.
Okay, I mean, just to simplify, let's assume corruption doesn't exist, right? That's a status quo. Otherwise, we can just really go down rabbit holes. But, okay, so maybe you get your views. So, there's a lot to unpack here,
definitely.
right? First of all, the government situation. So, do you think it's sustainable for governments to support 50%? Right? And as well as from an economist point of view. And second of all, what do you think about the implementation of a 12-month maternity leave as well as the way it more aligns with the corporate status quo?
I agree a lot with what you say is that, small companies simply couldn't afford it. The examples that you cited, it's a big companies, right? They have a lot of resources at hand. Definitely. And of course, for our public listed company, we can do that, right? We can enforce some kind of regulations for that. For the smaller company, then that comes the issue, right? What do they do, right, when the women go on maternity leave? And I think in Malaysia, not just like the child, like the giving birth itself, but women are also expected to take care of the child for maybe a few months before considering going back to employment. That's why you have this like long maternity leave. There has been talks about introducing paternity leave to kind of balance out the effect. There's also been talks about considering flexible working arrangements with these women. So if we can come to a terms that the women can still continue to be productive, and I gotta assume that some of the women doesn't really want to be completely out of the labor force during this time, but simply because they have like family commitments and they can't physically go to the office to perform their job functions. So they need like an alternative arrangement.
Right.
So doing that will actually, encourages more women to probably stay in the labor force while also, handling their families' responsibilities.
Right. Okay, so
in a
maybe
way.
since I'm the moderator, right, let me throw it back to the two of you. Right? How can women improve their ask from the government to mandate a 50%, I don't want to use the word subsidy, but that's how most people describe it, right? And second of all, to Hadesh, right, as a businessman, what areas do you think businesses can do to accommodate the 50% that... So when I say 50%, I don't just mean monetary costs.
Yeah.
It can be any creative solution which effectively, transfers the value in a more, affirmative role, right? Acknowledging that women do have these increased societal pressures, right? How do women ask government to basically, support the incremental 50% from the tax base? How would you justify it in a capitalistic way, right? If that's the way you put it.
Well, I think this is not really a capitalistic way. This is more like a socialist way,
Right.
of the government subsidizing certain life choices
Right.
or necessities in life. And I think government in Malaysia already do that to a large extent in our education sector, in our public healthcare sectors. So to extend that to females on maternity leave, for let's say just 3 months,
Right.
as an extension of the public healthcare system will actually there's a lot of benefits that come with it.
Definitely.
Right? Alleviating
Okay,
the
no,
cost.
I mean,
of
as
the
an
private
economist,
sector.
where do you see funds can be reallocated to? Let's pretend there's no corruption, okay? Like, of course, corruption is the easy answer, right? But I mean, let's do the difficult answer.
Just
Where
print
can
money.
we? Huh?
Just print the damn money.
Then we get inflation, right? No, you know why? Because I'm really thinking from a policymaker's point of
Yes.
view,
Yeah.
Where are we going to get the money from, right? Because obviously this is a great solution, right? Let's help our government actually do this. Where do you think we can actually, find the value creation to implement such a required socialist policy?
So I think one way we can look at it is how much women contribute to the labor force if they can continue to have these solutions like paid by the government and then easily go back to the workforce after their maternity leave.
Right.
Because when women can work, it means that they're also paying more taxes.
Right.
And we see that in the long run, if you gather more experience that we have talked about,
Right.
you earn higher and higher wages. So if women can earn in a lifetime, maybe it's worth it, for like 1 or 2 kids. It's actually economically sound for the government to do that because they can expand their tax base.
So it's basically an investment.
Yes.
Right? Yeah, okay. So Hadesh, we want your thoughts about how, right, businesses can help women in this matter.
Yeah. Before I go to business, just a thought to me. Like, actually, this also could be, what we always talk about, unconventional monetary policies, right? If you look at all these countries, we also have a different problem, which is the falling birth rates, which is going to affect economic growth. Every country that has tried this so-called baby bonus, right? They have all failed, right? It's pretty well known already now. That has never worked. So maybe this could be actually a way around it. You encourage women to have maternity leave, but they are paid over a longer period, then maybe that might actually change it. That might encourage them to reproduce, right?
Nice.
Because they are not making a sacrifice in that sense. Right? They're still going to earn their wage, right? So maybe that could be one way. I think from a business point of view, you want a balance between the moral obligation, which, to be fair, not every business person buys into that, right? So that will account for the downright prejudice, right? That they don't believe this is worth paying for maternity leave. But I would like to think that increasingly more and more business people believe in this, so they're willing to pay for it. But there is a real cost. So
Yes.
that is a real constraint. I think we can establish that. So from a business point of view, what is of interest to me is that the pain, actually, I'll be very honest here, is that when I pay for maternity leave and then they don't come back,
Right.
that is really painful.
Yes.
Right,
Okay, and
right.
it happens a lot.
Okay,
Right?
how do we solve this?
Well, you can't solve it because employees have the right to choice, right? I think that is one of the problems. So it's also maybe a trust issue, right? Or building, okay, maybe not trust, but sort of
A risk
loyalty.
issue.
Right.
Loyalty
Right.
that the flip side of that is the risk lah.
So Doris, do you think that employers are justified to bond people who take maternity leave? to prevent this and reduce the risk to society and lower the cost of society, right?
Very, very difficult question to answer. I might get cancelled for this.
It's okay.
Well, socially, if you talk about
Academic
equity,
freedom.
no, they shouldn't, right? People
Right.
should have the liberty, have a personal choice to pursue what they want.
Right.
But economically, as an economist, I think it makes economic sense and business sense for business to do that. So having that is a double-edged sword, right? Like at one point, maybe companies can refuse to offer these packages to
Right,
women
right.
that doesn't want to be bonded. But at the same time, it also encourages companies to take in women who are already married and more likely to have kids in the next 1 to 2 years, right?
Yes.
Because they know the women, once they have go on a maternity, they will come back in the
Right.
future. So it's an So every time the company hires someone, it's an investment in the
Yes.
human resources. Right?
Yes.
If the company can be convinced that this is a worthwhile investment, even after taking into factors the maternity period, then I think it's a win-win. Right? I think right now when we look at all these social taboo that we shouldn't talk about maternity and all that stuff, well, businesses won't talk about it. They just won't take any action against their economic interests. Kind of like a social and economic issues right there that we are trying to solve. They're refusing to be honest about
I
it.
think it's just basically a political issue. Right?
Yeah.
Ultimately, it hasn't changed the point that the sticking issue here is really about participation in the economy, right? But I think a lot of people have not considered all these other things that we spoke about in terms of the ability for companies to actually afford it. Yeah, Doris, you want to maybe wrap up or have some final thoughts for our listeners to take away?
Thank you both for inviting me for this episode. I think other than my existing knowledge and insights, I think I also gather a lot of information and debates from both of you. We discuss really difficult topics, things that probably people refuse to talk about, but we discuss it in depth over here to give the audience a perspective of what is it like to consider all these factors before looking at the overall policies.
No, I think we actually have a really good setup here because you have two economists, a really seasoned businessman,
Yes.
and one of them which happens to be a woman. Right? So we really have a really all-inclusive lens to really become a think tank on this issue on behalf of government.
Okay, all right. So with that, Doris, thank you so much. Once
Thank
again,
you.
you are our first guest. It was a pleasure having you. We look forward to the next topic and hopefully soon we'll have other guests as well.
Yes.
You want to close the episode?
So if you enjoy this kind of content, please remember to like and subscribe to this channel. We'll see you in the next episode.